Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are, where the World Wide Web is broadcasting. We are delighted that you are joining us for this, our ultimate and our final conversation as part of our 50 years, 50 book series with chapter16.org. Today is a real fun one, perhaps. Maybe there will be other adjectives we can throw in as well. We are going to be discussing Gregory McDonald's Fletch. And in conversation this evening, we have Michael Ray Taylor, who is a writer in Arkansas, whose most recent book is Hidden Nature. Michael Ray Taylor has been writing for Chapter 16 since the first week it started. So, on an occasion where we're marking time, what a wonderful writer to have in our presence. Also in our presence, Ace Atkins is an award-winning New York Times bestselling author who started his writing career as a crime beat reporter in Florida. Don't Let the Devil Ride is his 30th novel. His previous novels include 11 books in the Quinn Colson series and multiple true crime novels based on infamous crooks and killers. In 2010, he was chosen by Robert B. Parker's family to continue the iconic Spencer series, adding 10 novels to the franchise. He lives in Oxford, Mississippi with his family. And what are these two folks doing with us this evening? Well, they're going to be in conversation as part of the 50 years, 50 books series at chapter16.org, where we've been exploring 50 significant books published in Tennessee in the last 50 years. This program has been, will be almost over, but it's still being presented by Humanities Tennessee as part of the organization's 50th anniversary year. Please visit chapter16.org when this conversation is complete for the full list and additional features. Again, we're so pleased to have you, our audience, here, and we are also extremely thrilled to have Mr. Michael Ray Taylor and Ace Atkins.
All right. Well, I have to say here at the start that it's great being here with Ace. I have followed your career a long, long time, reviewed your books a long, long time, and it's nice to see you face to face, even if it's through a machine.
Well, thanks, Michael. I appreciate that very much.
Fletch, I think there's a lot of writers who can recall the moment they first discovered Fletch, and I was wondering if you could kick us off by.
It's funny when I talk usually about how did I get into crime fiction and the kind of books I'm really into. Sometimes maybe not totally accurately. I talk about Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and the gateway into crime fiction, and I talk about that. But what really changed my life completely, the kind of books I wanted to write, was Gregory McDonald. And Gregory McDonald, I came to Fletch because of the film. And I love the movie, and I love Chevy Chase, and of course it's much sillier, and there are parts of it, but there are also some really good parts in the original Fletch as well, some very Fletch-like behavior. But I didn't know that it was a book series. All I knew, I was 15 years old. I was living in Alabama, and back then there was no eBay, there was no internet, and I went to the used bookstore, and you could go there and find for 50 cents or 99 cents these paperbacks, and it was Fletch and Confessed Fletch and Karaoke Fletch and all this stuff. And I was like, boy, I got to read that. And it was terrific. It was absolutely terrific. And what an impact it made on me, not only, turning me to become a writer, but also wanting to become a reporter and be a journalist and be like, young Fletch, working the crime beat. And that's what I did. And I don't think without Fletch, I would have never ended up in Florida, working as a crime beat reporter as a Metro. And there was probably not a day that went past. Of course, I was not as cool as Fletch, not as easygoing as Fletch, and not as world weary as Fletch. But man, did these books make a huge impact on everything.
Well, and Florida crime always has a funny side to it.
No doubt.
The crime. I've got to share my story after yours. I'm a little bit older. You can kind of see here. I was the novel, the first novel, Fletch itself, is 50 years old, just like Humanities Tennessee.
I read your piece on that. Yeah.
I was only 12 when it came out, but sometime shortly thereafter, I was probably about 15 or 16. I used to, until I finally got a jalopy I could drive, I went all over Daytona Beach, Florida, where I grew up, on my bicycle. And a place I went a lot was a bookstore in Bel Air Plaza. You could, if the book were heavy enough and you had a good enough arm, you could hit the beach tossing it. But they had a lot of 25 and 50-cent used paperbacks in the back. And I want to say it may have been Confess Fletch was the first one I found. It was a few years after he'd been writing them. But I was immediately captured by the humor as a teenager. And later on, when I became a journalist myself, actually, I kind of graduated to all the other great Florida crime writers, because even though Fletch is not a Florida character, he starts out on the West Coast in California. There's a whole lot of that West Coast sensibility. And there were so many great crime writers in Florida at the time also, the other McDonald and,
Sure.
and Hyacin, and I just kind of dove in and really haven't come up for breath since. So,
absolutely, and I think there's something in common with McDonald and those other Florida, with the Florida crime writers, is that thread of humor, and that skeptical eye that Fletch has. But when I got into, the first thing I read was Fletch. I mean, the first thing I read was Fletch, and then I don't know if you can see behind me, these were these omnibus collections that were put out back in the 90s, and I read them all in original paperbacks. But I was just taken by the humor and the rhythmic structure of the dialogue. I think I learned so much about writing dialogue from reading Gregory McDonald, and that quick patter was just phenomenal. And just by happenstance, of course, I was, at the same time I'm reading this stuff in high school, I'm being force-fed to read, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, all this kind of stuff. But I think as a junior in high school, I was being told to read For Whom the Bell Tolls. And it was Farewell to Arms. Farewell to Arms. I was reading Farewell to Arms. And in, I think, Fletch's Moxie, it's all in Key West. It's all in Key West. I mean, I read these books 30 plus years ago, and I still remember. And there's a great scene where they recreate this wonderful scene from A Farewell to Arms. And I was reading that at the same time then I was reading Fletch's Moxie, and it just all came together. And I think in McDonald, there was a tremendous nod to Hemingway with that spare sentence structure, the great dialogue, the compact writing. He was definitely a truly Hemingway-inspired writer.
It wasn't until I began researching him for my essay in this series that I found out what an educated guy Gregory McDonald was. He studied classics. He went to Harvard. He wrote these very weighty pieces for the Boston Globe throughout the 60s, with especially covering the counterculture. But he didn't try to show off any of that in the novels. It's no wonder that the movies keep being made from them, because they practically read like screenplays just as they are, with all of the dialogue and the witty banter and very sparse description, but lots of action.
They really do. And I think both the middle film, withstanding, I think the first Chevy Chase movie, the John Hamm film, really are, pretty decent interpretations of the books, but you really, as a screenwriter, would have to be an idiot to screw it up, because it's all there for you. And it's so bare bones and so just right there for the film. I know they had to throw in some kind of slapstick stuff for Chevy Chase, and that's how the movie got made. But it's when you pull that stuff aside, it's still kind of got a grittiness to it. I mean, it really does. And it really captures the newsroom culture, which McDonald knew so well. And they're just a lot of fun. I think that the biggest crime is that there weren't more movies made. And I thought John Hamm was terrific.
Oh yeah, I did too.
I thought it was a great Confess Fletch, and pretty damn close to the book. I don't think there's any reason why there can't be more films. I think it'd be a fantastic series.
I'm a lifelong Chevy Chase fan, but I got to say I like the John Hamm version of Fletch.
Interesting, yeah. Interesting. Yeah, no, I agree. He is that, talking about the stuff with McDonald and his background covering the counterculture in Boston. I mean, Fletch is definitely a product of the 70s. He is that era. And, we go back and we think about Raymond Chandler and with Philip Marlowe being a product of the 1940s and going on to Ross McDonald and being very much of the 1960s with the self-introspection. And Fletch is just the perfect counterculture hero. He really is. Wears cutoff shorts to the newsroom and T-shirts and flip-flops. I mean, he just doesn't care. And
he's always on the verge of being fired.
Always on the and just. I think that's always what always what I wanted to be was Fletch, he just didn't give a damn. I mean, that's what we want to be. We want to be the guy that just doesn't care. And Fletch did care about getting to the source of truth, but he didn't really give a damn about all the bullshit. And that's, I think it's very timely today is so many people are not very focused on the truth and focused on the BS. And Fletch was, the perfect hero for those times, but I think he's kind of come around again as being a perfect hero for these times as well.
Well, he certainly feels very contemporary. Now, I did mention in the essay, only because I so much flew through it, enjoying it entirely as a teenager, there's a few things that most modern writers wouldn't do. And if McDonald were still writing, I bet he wouldn't do also in terms of, some of Fletch's worst habits. But at the same time, he's just your typical carefree bad boy.
Yeah.
So he is portrayed that way.
What do you say? It was McDonald in an interview was always say he was the barefoot boy with cheek or something like that. That was always his comment. But he was such a spare construction, and but the dialogue is just lovely to watch. It's just almost musical off the page.
I can't think of any other contemporary writer whose books are sometimes 90% dialogue. And I didn't do it, but other people I found online have gone through and counted the percentage of dialogue in different books. And it's always at least half dialogue.
Well, I think that it takes a particularly true talent and somebody very literary to pull it off. That's a hard act to do. It looks very effortless on the page, and it looks like there's a lot of white space and there's this dialogue flowing. But going back to Hemingway, very Hemingway style, very spare, very journalistic, very but that rapid fire. And he, I think with Fletch's Moxie, there's this kind of nod also to the 1930s, and there's this nod to classic film, classic literature that I think he really embraced and saw his own in his storytelling. But it looks effortless, but you got to be damn good to pull it off. I mean, I can't really go to a Fletch page and say, well, let's tear this out. Yeah. Everything, it's rhythmic, it's funny, it pops, it's got a rhythm to it, and it's fantastic. I mean, again, it really, going back to when I was 16 and 17, I mean, that's who I look to teach me a tremendous amount about dialogue. Yeah.
And it gets those Hemingway moments in the little bit of description that's there is always, picture perfect. What I love is he'll always throw a word you don't expect into a sentence. And then I think other writers wind up stealing it, whether consciously or unconsciously later on. One of the things I noticed in the original, a line I really liked, where he was talking about the newsroom camaraderie, and he says, despite all the bureaucracy, sometimes they can actually commit journalism. And the use of commit as the verb really made me grin there. And it made me remember an essay I was reading in Outside Magazine in the 1970s, where someone was lying out under the stars in the Sonoran Desert doing a long hike, and said, staring up at such a view, I thought I might commit philosophy. And I realize now he stole that from McDonald.
That's fantastic.
But so many perfect little words like that here and there. But
he was an absolute wordsmith, and that compact. And it was the same thing of, for 10 years I worked for the Robert Parker estate, and there's a lot of similarities, I think, between Parker and McDonald, and the fact that they were both extremely educated men, very steeped in the classics, knew exactly what they were doing. They were not slumming. They were not trying to write, mysteries for the sake of mysteries or whatever. They were really trying to, they had Parker always said that people come to his books essentially for the language. And I think it's the same thing with McDonald. I think when you really break it down, the love of it is the beauty of it on the page. And one thing I always talk about frequently in book talks and that kind of stuff is anybody off the street can write something where people are walking and talking. You can write that. You can sit down and write that. That's not writing. But the musicality of the stuff is what McDonald had in spades. And it's lovely. I could pick up one of his books right now and come to any page and it would just be, just rhythmic and fantastic.
Fletch talking to anyone is like Spencer and Tracy in some of their great exchanges.
There was a part actually when I was writing. So when I was hired to write the Spencer books after Mr. Parker passed away, is I would write parts of the book and I'd have to go back and do it because it sounded like Fletch. And I really did. And I was like, this is not Spencer. Spencer has a little edgier to it. And the thing about writing, if I was writing Fletch just doesn't care. Fletch is totally egoless and completely. And so I had to go back and straighten that out because Fletch is so hardwired into my psyche. But I wish the only regret with Fletch is I wish there were more books.
Yeah. And, as Southerners, I enjoyed some of the more Southern books that I didn't read until much later, some of the Son of Fletch books, talking about words. I remember there's one scene where a guy's trying to get away somewhere in Tennessee and he can't get away. And Fletch Jr. says, I think you hit a stop.
I have to admit, Michael, I devoured every Fletch book and some of the Flynn books, but I did not read any of the Son of Fletch books or the Schuyler books, so I am not very versed on those.
I have not read the Schuyler books myself, but Son of Fletch showed up in that cheap paperback bin. And so I've got maybe 3 or 4 of those on my shelf still from when I was young.
It's very strange. He seemed like a very ritualistic man in the fact that he, I'm looking here behind me in these 3, the omnibus of the Fletch books is he almost said there's 9 books and that's it. And I'm not going to do any more. And I think it would have been very advantageous in his career in the 80s. He could have really done a lot more Fletch books, but he just seemed to draw the line of this is it. And he did those prequels of Fletch 1, Fletch 2, and they were terrific. I really enjoyed those books. But after that, he really walked away and refused to write any of it, which I thought was fascinating.
Well, something I noticed, doing a real close read of the first book, Fletch, is that it's exactly 250 pages long. And I wouldn't be surprised if most of the others are like that. He mapped it all out in his head at some level as he was doing it.
That doesn't surprise me. He seemed to be very, very, again, I guess the word I'm using again is ritualistic as far as the way he was doing this, but he just seemed to not budge with the 9 books, and that was it. I'm going to do 9 books and that's out. But they're terrific, and I think for people who only know the movies, they're so much fun. But they're also very smart. They're very clever. They really do remind me of the quick, witty banter in like a 1930s screwball comedy.
Right.
They have that feel. They have that Dashiell Hammett kind of thin man kind of edginess to them,
and yet in the shadows of the humor, there's a more serious noir often.
Oh, always. Always. You go back to Fletch with the drug running and the murder for hire plot and Confess Fletch. They always have great mysteries to them. There's always great mystery. The stolen art in Confess Fletch, and there's always something going on that's very compelling that's drawing you in. But the humor is, I think, what makes Fletch. That makes everything in Fletch. Right. The humor is everything. Yeah.
Well, speaking of noir, that's a place you've been an awfully lot in your career, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, which I truly, truly enjoyed and savored, the classic noir in modern, semi-modern Memphis with also international intrigue. It's really quite a combination. But I wonder if if we could take a little bit of time away from Mr. McDonald, just so you can talk about how you came to compress all of these elements into a book in Memphis.
It's funny. I worried about kind of taking the heat when the book was published, because there is this international factor of these unsavory characters descending on Memphis, as far as these international villains and bad guys. And I was like, are people really going to buy these these international Bondian villains coming to Memphis? And then only a couple of months later, Elon Musk shows up to build his supercomputer on the banks of the Mississippi. And I'm like, well, of course he did. That's exactly you end up in Memphis. Memphis is a weird town because it is so centrally located. I mean, that's why FedEx is there. Everything can go out of Memphis. Everything goes out there. And I think culturally for American culture, everything goes out from Memphis. Everything from blues to soul to Elvis, everything comes out of Memphis. Barbecue, Southern food, soul food, everything that I like is out of Memphis. And so when I wrote this book, I had been continuing on the works of Robert B. Parker, set in Boston. I had been writing a series of books that are very specific to North Mississippi, and as we call over here, the Mid-South, the Memphis area, North Mississippi, Arkansas, that kind of thing. And so this gave me the opportunity to do whatever I wanted to. And I mean, excuse my language, McDonald, he took Fletch to Brazil. If Fletch can go to Brazil, I can go to Egypt.
I often wondered if McDonald was going where he wanted to go and writing so he could take it off his taxes.
I think 100%. I don't know about the taxes. I think he went to where he wanted to go just to have a good time. Right. And I think maybe Fletch and Karaoke Fletch was, but he detailed it as a journalist. He had that journalist eye. So you got all that great travel log and all that kind of stuff. So for me, I've spent a decent amount of time in France. And so I was like, well, shit, I'll just write about France and I'll have some characters based on France. I'll come in. And there were, scenes that were, that all were connecting back to Memphis. And so I really was conscious of not necessarily having a distinct genre that I was writing. And every time I talk about it, you only get about 10 seconds to explain your book. But I'll say, well, it's a domestic thriller. It's about a woman who finds out that her husband has gone missing, and she finds out that he is not the man he was supposed to be and is a fraud. Okay, this domestic thriller, but it's also a PI novel because it's also the private investigator. There's a legendary black private investigator named Porter Hayes who is actually working this case to find out what had happened. So it's got kind of that classic PI thing. And then also it's an international thriller because it's involving Russian mercenaries, it's involving soldiers for hire, it's involving ancient antiquities being shipped up the river from Memphis. So I was able to kind of spin some plates on this. And I think that comes from, it's so funny, Michael, when you were mentioning the old, paperback store, man, that was my, I forget what it was called, but there was one that was in where I lived in Alabama, that was an old house. And man, that was my education, and things were not easily found. I mean, I remember even like Ian Fleming to find a James Bond book. Right. Many of those books were out of print. I mean, you just didn't go on, Amazon. You had to hunt those things down. Same thing with McDonald. I think there were several books that were out of print for McDonald. Mm-hmm. And that was my education. Read all of Ian Fleming, read all of Gregory McDonald, read Robert Parker, Elmore Leonard, and so those paperback stores, I really, I miss them because I learned so much. John D. McDonald, I read all that stuff.
Yeah, I love John D. McDonald. Of course, being from Florida, that was part of it.
Oh, the best.
I read all those paperbacks, and then later on, I went to graduate school. I got a creative writing degree. That let me teach college for years, but I learned what I know about writing from those stacks of paperbacks and those cheap books and the occasional things I was forced to read in high school. It's a good thing I was forced to read them.
Sure. Like I told you, I was reading Gregory McDonald at the same time I was reading Hemingway.
Exactly.
And it's all got a connection to
it. Well, let's see. I have no script here, but
do you want to talk about the Fletch movies?
Well, yeah, actually, I do. Somewhat. You mentioned you found Fletch by the Chevy Chase movie. Tell me about what you were doing at that point in your life and what pulled you into it so much.
Well, I guess this would have been the late summer, and please correct me if I'm wrong because it's been quite some time. Late summer '85, and you know, I have always been a huge moviegoer. I mean, I would see every movie, and I think in 1985 I saw every movie that came out. I'm not kidding. And I was 15 years old, and I remember seeing Fletch. I think it was the funniest thing I had ever seen in my life, and it was just, I think, in many ways, the secret of that film, as opposed to the follow-up, was that it had a great story that it was following, because it had really built upon the McDonald novel. And at whatever point Chevy Chase was attached to it, it still could be taken, if you took off the silly parts and the parts where he imagines he's, you know, the basketball player and all that stuff. It still has the framework of classic noir. I mean, you know, it's even, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Stanwyck, you know, that's very pointed, you know, it's Barbara Stanwyck, you know, it's Double Indemnity, it's all that stuff. So I think that, you know, the story, and I saw recently something that was written about Beverly Hills Cop and the, you know, continuation for that, and the fact that some of those films didn't work because there was not an anchor of a good crime story to follow. And in Beverly Hills Cop, there's a great crime story to follow. In fact, it was written for Stallone, you know, initially, and then Eddie Murphy comes out and does the jokes. But I think that I just loved it, and I've probably seen it, I'm not kidding, 1,000 times. And I think
you're flipping channels and it's on, you wind up watching the whole thing.
I mean, it's just, and are there parts of it, of course, that stray tremendously from the novel? Of course. But I think that Chevy Chase is the perfect Fletch in the fact that he really embodies the guy who just doesn't give a damn. And he's always been Fletch. And when you watch Foul Play or Seems Like Times, he's Fletch. I mean, he's Fletch. And so when you put him in that role, he's just perfection. And even when he's riffing and he's doing improv, it's still Fletch. And, you know, the scenes with Frank at the newsroom, and even though, you know, I know that I never could I could never pinpoint in the novels where they took place. And maybe there was clues to it, but it always just seemed like another very noir convention, which was the city. You know, it always seemed like it was just the city. And in the films, it's LA. But I never really, you know, what it was very noir convention. It's just
and in the novel, the beach is the beach.
The beach. It doesn't tell you. It's just very noir.
Any coast, anywhere.
We don't know, you know, and then they throw in the stuff about the Lakers and all that kind of stuff.
Well, you know, earlier when I said I liked the John Hamm version better, that's only because I was such a Chevy Chase fan. I could never not think about Chevy Chase as Chevy Chase when I was watching it, even though it did have a good plot, had great dialogue and all of that. I just kept, you know, that's was the heyday of SNL, and I was a religious SNL follower back then too. So.
And he was terrific. I mean, just terrific. But I think John Hamm, I really hope I corresponded briefly, and I'm forgetting right now for the moment the filmmaker who made the Fletch films. I corresponded with him briefly, and after the Fletch came out, and I said, I'm a huge Fletch fan, a big Gregory McDonald fan. I said, I think you guys did a great job. I wish Flynn had been in it. I guess there were some rights issues about how they had to change the character, that it wasn't actually Flynn from Confess Fletch and whatever. But there's a great Fletch is just a timeless character, and I think in this age where we are, you think about the time that Fletch was coming about, and you're talking about the world of Watergate and post-Vietnam and just complete disenchantment with the government and bureaucracy and the world. That's where Fletch comes in, and that's where Fletch enters. And Fletch right now is the man of the times, because we are entering, you know, the same kind of era of people, you know, really, really disenchanted with their government and mistrust, and the world kind of off kilter. And I think that's where so hopefully they'll make another film. I really love
that movie. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking it came out only a couple of years after All the President's Men, which you know, captured that time very well also, but in a very different sort of way.
I guess you're talking about between Fletch and All the President's Men?
Yeah.
I think it probably was at least 10 years. I mean,
was it really?
Yeah, I mean, All the President's Men was almost crazy rolling out after Watergate.
Okay, I thought it
I would
was
say
a long time to make. But I don't know. I've watched it a dozen times, but I don't remember the
But
background.
you know, I call all this stuff, and I think there's other people, you know, there are people that are film historians call it newspaper noir.
Yeah,
And you know, back in the day, that's what Fletch is. I mean, Fletch is newspaper noir. And you watch, you know, God knows there's countless movies in the 1930s where the hero is, you know, is the newspaper reporter. And we looked at newspapers in the 1930s as being the people to tell us the truth and the people to get through the bureaucracy and to get through the false, you know, facades of the, to get through the facades of the politicians and the dirty lies and the corruption. I mean, you mean Superman is a journalist, you know, and I think that's where McDonald was drawing upon that pool of looking at the classic newspaper noir. And now, so much of that is dead, and I hate that because I was fortunate, and I have no doubt I was drawn to that world by McDonald's influence. I got in the last days of the newspaper business, where it was the old classic days, and this was in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and this is before, you know, I remember going to a meeting one time and saying, the internet is going to make us better. The internet is going to sell more papers, and you know, all these old grizzled journalists were looking at each other and saying, how is that going to work? You're going to give our product away for free. But it was kind of the end of an era. And so I think that when I think back at, you know, we don't have those newspapers that we trust to get to the source of the problem, to get to telling us the truth, what's happening, and that kind of unfiltered eye. And I miss that. I miss that jaundiced eye about America.
Luckily, we have newspaper journalists like you and Michael Connolly and Carl Hyacin who still bring some of that journalist instinct.
I hope so. I really do. I really miss it, and I miss, you know, hearing the print run but it's exciting. It was exciting, you know, to be in the newsroom, and it was exciting to, you know, even have an editor yell at you like Frank.
Right.
You know? And you know, it's right, you know. And I'll tell you what, there's a lot of times I watch movies or read books when they have the way that they have newspaper reporters acting, it's not correct.
Right.
But there was nothing false in Fletch, and McDonald knew exactly what he was writing about. I remember years ago, there's a very famous journalist here in Mississippi named Curtis Wilkie, and Curtis is just a tremendous reporter and had worked for years at the Boston Globe. And the first question I asked him, I said, did you know Gregory McDonald? And he said, no. He said, I wish I had. He said, I got there just a couple of years too late, but he was a legend at the Globe.
Right. I spent one summer at the Houston Chronicle. Most of my journalism background in my 20s was a freelancer for magazines, and that's a whole different beast, which is also dying, but it's a whole different beast. But I got to experience just a little bit of that newsroom camaraderie and you know, late at night after deadline, all the journalists sitting around telling stories. It's intoxicating.
It is. And I was really fortunate at that time. You're talking about Florida crime writers and whatever. One of my really wonderful friends was Tim Dorsey, and Tim and I were at the Tampa Tribune at the same time, and we were all, you know, acolytes of John D. McDonald and Carl Hyacin and all that kind of stuff. And that's what we
acolyte of Hunter S. Thompson in a lot.
Yes, yeah, of course, yeah, Tim's book, and we just had that stuff perpetually coming off the wire or stuff that we were covering locally, and it was wonderful training. For a young writer, it was invaluable for me to have editors being very hard on my work and having to really one very specific thing, which has kind of been lost these days, is get to the point. What's the story? Get to the point. And McDonald is just, you know, there's just everything is just like first page. Everything is very journalistic. Everything is you can't put it down because there's no filler. It's all story.
Have you ever been tempted to write a journalist protagonist?
Well, I did. I did in one book that was about Tampa in the 1950s. Okay. And I was fortunate in the 90s to be there at the tail end when there still were some of the cops and the reporters who had covered the old mafia back in the 1950s and all that kind of stuff. And so I wrote a novel about that. But I don't know, what is the role of the journalist today? You know, do we sell, you know, you know, you're talking, it's just crazy. I mean, I always admired journalists growing up, and I always admired people like Fletch, because we you know, we need people like Fletch. We need people like Fletch to tell us, to cut through. We know in Gregory McDonald's world that politicians are corrupt. We know the wealthy are controlling the system. We know everything is rigged. We understand that. We've got a very mature view of the world. But Fletch, you know, is able to bring you the truth. And we don't have that anymore.
Sort of give them the finger while he's doing it, you know, just that total irreverence toward the stuffed shirts and the power mongers.
Absolutely.
It's goods on them.
I mean, we need Fletch. I mean, we do. We need Fletch, and we need people, you know, but I always, you know, but now it's so crazy. It's how the world has changed. I was, you know, recently on vacation at the beach, and there was a t-shirt shop, and they had a thing where they were showing you could buy a t-shirt where you could hang a journalist. And I thought, what has happened in this world where the people who are bringing us the truth and honesty and, you know, delivering that stuff are vilified, and it's very scary times. I think Mr. McDonald would agree.
Yeah, I'm sure he would have pen in hand were he still with us.
Yeah,
and be writing about some of that very behavior.
Okay.
Well, it looks like we're about near our mark here. I know you could teach a master class in Gregory McDonald if you have a chance, but I'm so glad you were able to come and join us today, because when they told me that you don't just write an essay, you talk about the book, I thought, who's the one person in the world I could really learn something from, and that would be Ace Atkins.
Well, that's very nice. I'm a huge fan of Gregory McDonald, and feel totally indebted to him for many different reasons. But I don't think he's talked about as enough as he should be. And I was delighted to see that you made him the subject of the series, because he's one of the greats, and Fletch is one of
all of the books in the 50-book series, and said, you can pick from about 20 of these. Which one would you like to do? I immediately said Fletch. And I was so glad he was there as one of my choices.
One of my biggest regrets is I knew that McDonald had moved to Tennessee, which was just crazy. He's not a Southern character, you know. He's about as Massachusetts as you get. You know, I wish in his later years I didn't know that he had been ill, and you know, I had no idea. I always thought I'd go get to meet him, and I always thought he's not that far. You know, it would have been easy, and I kept on waiting for an opportunity to kind of meet McDonald and tell him how much his work had meant to me.
You know, if he had gotten his prostate cancer just 7 or 8 years later, the treatments had so advanced. You know, it was a nuisance, but I'm past my prostate cancer. And if I had gotten mine at the same time McDonald did, I probably wouldn't be here talking with you now. And it's a real shame, because he could have gone on to produce a lot more books, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
But speaking of a lot more books, I hope we get to see this investigator again, because he's a great one.
So do I. But it is, you know, again, you know, all this stuff, everything is influenced by something else, and everything is, you know, and you see behind me in my paperbacks, and, you know, you see here, or if I can point in the right direction, behind me somewhere this way, there we go. We look at the Fletch books, just massive influence. And then above that, Ian Fleming,
right.
John D. McDonald.
A whole Dashiell Hammett row you can't see right over there. Just out of the frame here, but
and those books really, you know, really become hardwired into your storytelling. And I feel bad for writers who don't know Gregory McDonald, because man, did I pick up some tricks of writing dialogue from him.
I think he's the best at dialogue of any of our contemporary crime writers.
No doubt,
they're all good, but he's the best.
No, the best. Just a joy to read out loud. I think that. There's so many times I'm reading, you know, writers that are sent to me, and there's a filler of this, and this guy picked up the phone and hello, and this kind of goes on and whatever. And McDonald has none of that. Everything is just starts and starts, and everything is just crisp and just refined. I think that's the best word, refined.
And you need no backstory, because you know exactly who you're talking to, who you're reading, just by the way they talk.
Exactly. And that's a talent. That's
That
a
is a real talent. Making it look easy when it's so hard.
no doubt.
Well, with that, I think that's a good ending point, and I want to thank you again for your time, and I want to thank Chapter 16 in Humanities Tennessee for letting me dive into Fletch and remember those teenage years in the cheap box at the bookstore.
Michael, thank you so much for doing this. When the name came up of Gregory McDonald, I was thrilled to be on here with you, and thanks so much for asking me.
You're muted, Patrick.
What's he saying? Who knows? All right, the mic is working. We're going to keep the gratitude rolling here. Michael and Ace, thank you so much for closing out our 50 years here. We really appreciate this dive, as you mentioned, into the world of Fletch and Gregory McDonald. And here's to the next 50 years. Thank you so much. And happy summer, one and all.
Yeah, stay cool. Thanks again, Ace. Very nice to see you and talk to you at the same time.
A pleasure. Hopefully we'll continue this conversation.
Yes, and maybe even have a beer in Mississippi.